All right, so this podcast is going to be a follow up to the last podcast I did, which was titled Viewer Discretion Advised, The Ugly Reality. So, if not listened to that, I will encourage you to listen to that podcast. It will put a lot of context to what I'm about to say. But in that podcast, I was talking about the need for us to sometimes be exposed to the ugly part of life. I think it's very important for us to be exposed to the ugly part of life. And in the podcast, I talked about sometimes we find ourselves trying to be shielded from what we call negative news, bad news, disturbing content. So we try to shield our minds from these things. And I think it can have a very adverse effect on our humanity. I really believe that the human being is given the capacity to see the ugly so that the human being can do good. A human being that is shielded from ugly can never do good. If you want to do the highest good in your life, sometimes you will be required to see the darkest bad. And when I put up this podcast, I had one of my mentees send me a question, and that's why I decided to do a follow-up. It was a very good question, so I asked him to send the question to me and asked his permission to answer it on the podcast. And I want to thank my mentee for giving me this opportunity to answer this question on the podcast. So I'm going to read out the question from my mentee. It says, my question is, where do we draw the line between being aware of our realities and safeguarding our space from content that drains our energy? Personally, when I go online, I want to feed on hopeful content that inspires me to see the good in where I am, especially in Nigeria. This is a good question. And that's why I think it's very important that I get to answer this question here. Where do we draw the line between safeguarding our mind from content that seems negative and exposing ourselves to ugly content that inspires us and propels us to do good? Now, I'll be honest with you. Up until about a few weeks ago, when I watched that video of a man who had to watch his wife die because they couldn't afford 50,000 naira as deposit at a hospital, I was also of the mentality that this, our mind, was for safekeeping from negative content. I really thought that the essence of building your mind, the core of building your mind, is keeping your mind in a place where you do not get bad, in quote, negative information. But you see, the experience I had with watching that video made me think again about my positioning on what the positioning of our mind should be. And so I'll share it with you right now. I really think that this thing called hope is not a passive thing, but an active thing. Hope is not a passive thing. It's not an abstract thing. Hope is an action. Hope is a light caused by an action of somebody. Hope doesn't exist without somebody acting. It is the action of somebody that gives hope. And a lot of times, you are the hope for somebody else. Hope doesn't exist arbitrarily. Hope is created by an action. So I'll put it this way. If there were an earthquake and the whole town came down and there was rubble all around, hope is that one person caught under the rubble that decides to scream, "I am alive." That sound of that person's voice is the sound of hope. That person deciding to take that action to cry out, "I am alive, I am here." That is hope. That action is what triggers hope in other people's mind that, oh, not everybody is dead. Hope is an action. It's not an arbitrary thing. And so a lot of times we must act in the midst of bad for people to have hope. A hopeless situation is when people refuse to act anymore. When everybody refuses to act, then it's hopeless. Your ability to act in the midst of the ugly is what we call hope. So I'll put it this way. There is no hope without ugly. There is no hope without ugly. Your response to an ugly situation, your positive response to a negative situation is what others see as hope. Hope is not a passive thing. Hope is an active thing. It's an act of positivity in a surrounding of negativity. And when I got to realize this, I got to realize that if I do not see ugly situations, if I'm not open to seeing really ugly, terrible things that scar me, that make me sad, there is no way I can act in hope. There's no way I can act in a way that gives hope to others. It is the ugly I see that precipitates an action for me to act in a hopeful way for others to say there is hope. It's just like somebody, I don't know if you've ever heard a story like this, but there have been stories like this over time. Somebody leaves a bag with valuables or money in a cab. In a cab. The person forgets it in a cab. And the cab driver takes that money, a huge amount of money, to a radio station to say, "I found this money in my cab. I don't know who owns it, but now I want to announce it here so that the owner can come and get the money." I've heard it. There are not very many. There are not very many stories like this, but there have been a few. And then somebody comes to the radio station and says, "That's my bag. I left that money in the cab. I forgot it in the cab, and I thought it was gone forever. I never believed that this cab driver can act in such a way to bring this money here instead of taking it for himself. And a lot of times when people act that way, people say, oh, there is a lot of hope for Nigeria. What do people call hope? Hope is when people act right in the midst of heavy negativity. So you see, what people call hope is the action of that cab driver, not the thought, not the arbitrary thought that Nigeria will get better. It is somebody acting in a way that is very contrary to the culture that people say there is hope. Hope is normally a small flicker of good action in the midst of intimidating ugly. That is what hope is. You see, I don't believe that we as Christians, and I'm going to talk about Christians right now. I don't think this thing is restricted to Christians, but I want to talk about Christians because I'm going to cite some things in the Bible right now. So please allow me to talk as a Christian. I don't think the mentality of Christians saying, I do not want negative information. I want to keep my mind always on the positive is a very Christian way of acting. I do not think so. I see a lot of Christians do it in the name of positive confession, protecting and guarding your mind, saying, I will not watch this, I will not look at this, I will not focus on this, I will not do this. We need to be very careful where we draw the line between focusing and being aware. I think a lot of Christians live in a bubble, and this is not a Christian mindset. The Bible doesn't encourage us to live in a bubble. As a matter of fact, right from the first book of the Bible, we were introduced to ugliness as the start of anything good. The first book of the Bible, the first chapter of the Bible, tells us about the condition of the earth being dark, void, and ugly. He said, God looked at the earth in its formless, ugly, dark state. And that in itself triggered the beautiful process of creation. Everything we see around us right now on the earth that looks beautiful, the trees, the plants, the wildlife, every single thing, the atmosphere, was all triggered by an initial ugly state, a state of void, a state of emptiness, a state of darkness. But God did not look away from this state. As a matter of fact, God looked intently into the state and decided to create better. We are meant to see ugly. You can never do good without looking at the ugly. Never. Man doesn't have the capacity to reach inside himself for the highest good without seeing the darkest ugly. So this mentality that as Christians, we must keep our minds always in a good place. No bad information. I don't want to hear that somebody is sick. Some Christians don't even want to hear that people died. There are some churches that you go, they do not want you to announce the passing away of somebody or that somebody is sick. It is unchristian-like. we must keep our minds in a good place is not a very good one. It isn't. It's a very passive mindset. It keeps you in a place of passivity, not godly activity. A lot of godly activity is triggered by darkness and ugliness. And I'll give some examples in the Bible. When you look at the story of Moses, who is a very strong character in both the Bible and the Quran, he's a strong character. The first consciousness of Moses' assignment, the first time he had an inkling of delivering his people, if you read the Bible, was a particular day when he saw an Egyptian mercilessly beat an Israelite. He saw a very ugly situation. I don't think a lot of people understand that it wasn't a slight beating. It was a beating that was meant to lead to death. It was a merciless beating. He saw this Egyptian man beat a Hebrew man mercilessly, that he felt a need to go and save the man. This was Moses, who had grown up in the palace, shielded from the reality of his people. And for the first time, he saw something so ugly that shook his world. He thought all was well till he saw this ugly situation and realized nothing was well. And he was so drawn to this situation that he acted to save the Hebrew. By so doing, killed the Egyptian. This was the beginning of Moses' journey to leading his people out of Egypt. It started with an ugly situation. He saw ugly content. He saw something that disturbed him greatly. If Moses never saw that thing, he would have still been in the palace, thinking all was well. The ugly inspires the good. The ugly inspires the good. There's another part of the Bible, in the book of Nehemiah. Now, there was this man, Nehemiah. He was working with the king. He was working with a king called Artaxerxes. And it was in a place called Susa. Susa was a relatively peaceful place. It was a seat of authority then. He was living a very peaceful life. Till one day he got some visitors from Jerusalem. He was someone that was exiled from Jerusalem. So here he was working this lofty position under a king in the palace. And this man came to visit him. And in that one visit, turned his life upside down. He asked them the condition of things in Jerusalem, if everything was well. And they told him, things are not just unwell, things are incredibly ugly. The whole place is a pile of rubble and ashes. This is like somebody in today's world. You have a friend that came to visit you and the person shows you a video on their phone of massacre in your hometown, telling you that the house you used to live in has caught fire, was ransacked, and was bulldozed. Nehemiah said this news did not only disturb him, it disturbed him for days. He said it made him weep bitterly. That's how ugly the news was. It was bitter. It was terrible. It was anything but pleasurable. It scarred his mind for days. It scarred his mind to the extent that when he went into work days later, the king could tell that he wasn't looking happy. He couldn't even pretend. That's how bad it was. But it was the beginning of his purpose in life. The ugly. He had to see that ugly. If he never saw that ugly, he would have walked with the king and he will never be recorded in the Bible. He began the rebuilding of the walls of Jerusalem. But he started with ugly information. Something his mind wasn't prepared for. Ugly precipitates the good. You see, there are so many stories of ugly precipitating the good in the Bible, but I can't mention every single one of them. But then I want to come to Jesus Christ. You see, there's a part of the Bible that always interested me whenever I read it. And I'm going to read out to you right now. It's in the book of Luke. Luke 13. From verse 1, I think, to verse 5. It says, about that time, Jesus was informed that Pilate had murdered some people from Galilee as they were offering sacrifices in the temple. That verse in its own tells us that Jesus was informed about a very ugly situation. This was Jesus. He was not holy to the point where he said, I don't want to hear anything bad. Don't ever come with bad news. I don't want bad energy. He said he was informed about a mass murder that had just happened. Someone informed him. Jesus was on top of the news. He didn't have the mentality that if it's not good news, don't bring it to me. They told him that Pilate had just murdered some Galileans while they were worshiping in the temple. If you go on, Jesus asked, is that why they suffered? Let me start again from verse 1. It says, about that time, Jesus was informed that Pilate had murdered some people from Galilee as they were offering sacrifices at the temple. Now, Jesus said this, do you think that those Galileans were worse sinners than all the other people from Galilee? He asked, is that why they suffered? Not at all. You will perish too unless you repent of your sins and turn to God. Now, verse 4 is a very interesting verse. It says, and what about the 18 people who died when the tower of Siloam fell on them? Were they the worst of sinners in Jerusalem? Now, this Jesus talking about another disaster that had happened. Some people had died in the collapse of a building. 18 people had died. 18 in a place called Siloam. And the place collapsed and they all died. That was a disaster. But Jesus knew about it. So any Christian that tells you, I do not listen to bad news, all I listen to is good news, is not Christ-like. Jesus heard bad news. In fact, people brought it to him. And this way, we must not have that mentality that I want to focus and hear the good of Nigeria. That is a very passive position. What is really expected of us is not just to hear the good of Nigeria, hear the good about Nigeria. You must be the good. We must not just desire hopeful news. We must be the hope. You see, everything that Jesus heard here, he didn't use it as a basis to complain about where he was oh, how terrible this place is, or how terrible Pilate is, how terrible the Romans are, how terrible the architecture in Siloam is. He didn't use as a means of complaining and whining. And that is where we draw the line. It is our response to this bad and ugly news. Our response to the bad and ugly is what defines whether we use it for good or for bad. A lot of us, the problem is when we see the ugly, we tend to complain, we tend to whine, we tend to bash. You see, when I watched that video with the man that lost his wife, and I read the comments, a lot of people use that opportunity to throw Nigeria under the bus, to throw the government under the bus. Some people abroad use that opportunity to gloat over the right decision they made in leaving Nigeria. I feel this is the wrong response. We do not see the ugly so that we can whine. God did not look at the ugly earth so that he can whine. It should inspire us to act. It should inspire us to act, not to whine, not to complain, not to bash. The ugly is to inspire us to act better, to be hope. That's where that's the line that I really believe ought to be drawn. The line should never be, should I see ugly or should I protect my mind? I think the protecting of the mind is not about not seeing ugly. Because if you're to look into reality, you will always see ugly. There's the ugly with your name on it. It's with your name on it not to traumatize you to complain, but it's meant to inspire you to begin to act. There's the ugly with your name on it because there's a solution with your name on it. So do we draw the line between I want my attention to be on good things in Nigeria? Is that really the question? I want to focus on good things in Nigeria. Or is it a matter of I want to be a good thing in Nigeria? When people talk about the good in Nigeria, I want them to mention my name as a good. When people talk about hope for Nigeria, I want them to mention my name as hope. A lot of times when we talk about good and we talk about hope, we talk about it with such passivity, as something we want to sit back and enjoy. But it's something we must create. It's something we must act towards. There is an ugly with your name on it. And it's important that when you find your ugly with your name on it, you do not look away. You do not look away. So I'm not saying go out on social media and just be looking for bad news. But the truth of the matter is that some will come to you. When it comes to you, will you reject it and say, I reject it, I don't want to see this, I don't want to do this? It will come to you. Like the ugly came to Moses. He was just walking and he saw. He had the choice then to look away or to look at that ugly and say, what can I do to change this? The ugly came to Nehemiah. He didn't tell his friends to stop telling him, I don't want to hear this anymore. I'm in a safe place right now. Please don't spoil my mind. He chose to listen to them and to take it all in, because right in that ugly was his assignment. In the ugly lies your assignment. In the ugly lies your assignment. So I really think that the defining thing between how you deal with ugly in a positive way and how you use ugly for good is when you see the ugly, does it drive you to do good? Or does it drive you to whine, complain, and worry? God doesn't give us ugly so that we can worry. God gives us ugly so that we can act. So that we can act so that someone else doesn't need to worry. There's a parable of the Good Samaritan, a man traveling and was beaten to a pulp by thieves. But then you had some people who were too holy to look at this man, to even touch him. So they crossed to the other side of the road because that side was too ugly. And then there was a man who decided to look at this ugly and to carry this ugly to the hospital and act and do good. God is not calling us to live in a bubble, to ignore those ugly situations around us. A lot of times it's telling us to look at it. To look at it so that we can act better. So that we can be hope. So that we can shine our light. So to answer this question, I think the summary of it is what we need to avoid is not negative content. But what we need to work on is not having a negative reaction to negative content. It is the reaction. Negativity is all around us unless you live in a bubble. And I don't think God is calling us to live in a bubble. God is calling us to live in the real world, but not to have a negative reaction, because that is just, it is too passive. It means you've become a victim. It is not having a negative reaction that God requires of us. When you see negativity or you hear negativity, what God is expecting us to do is to have the capacity to react with good. It's not about avoiding to hear the realities of what is going on in Nigeria, but to rise above the reaction of complaint, of surrender, of blame shifting, and to rise to the reaction of what can I do? God, what is my assignment in this situation? What is my message in this mess? It is the reaction that matters, not whether or not we should shield our mind from negativity. We must rise above being just Christian consumers. So when we say we go to social media, we go there to consume hopeful news. That's not bad, but there's more for us. What God is saying is that He wants us to become creators of hope too. He wants us to create hope rather than just feed off somebody's hope perpetually. He wants people to look to us and see hope in our every word. Even while there's darkness around, people can look to our light. So the question is not how to avoid negativity. The question is how to react right. My name is Tola, T.A. Alabi, and this is the TA Podcast.